Companies like BioWare, Square Enix, Kojima Productions, and essentially every single Sony-owned studio have been pumping out story-driven games year after year for the last decade and a half or so, and despite a lot of those games not having revolutionary gameplay mechanics, they are consistently getting awards and universal acclaim. But it hasn't always been the case, and it kind of left a lot of the gaming community split between people saying that they don't like this direction the industry is clearly taking, and people who are standing in line every time some new hot story-driven game comes out. And I have to say, I am very much into story-driven games, and after doing a ton of research, I think I finally understand why I feel the way I do, and why I think that this big emphasis on stories in video games we've been seeing recently is actually a good thing. Fair warning, I will touch upon some minor story details and use gameplay examples from GTA games, God of War 2018, Bioshock, Metal Gear Solid 4, Sniper Elite 2, Detroit Become Human, Far Cry 6, Uncharted 4 and It Takes Two. But there won't be any major spoilers for those games. I will be completely spoiling The Last of Us Part 1 though, and if you want to avoid it, unfortunately you will have to skip the entire Part 4 of this video. Timestamps are in the description. And also, in the same section, I will be talking about some story spoilers for Tomb Raider 2013. Okay, with all that out of the way, I want to talk about a small retro game named Zork. In the early days, most games didn't have a story at all. I mean, you don't really need an in-depth reason why different shapes are falling from the sky and why when you complete a line it disappears. Because the only reason to engage with said shapes was to have fun and beat a high score. And that was totally acceptable because gaming was still a fairly new and small niche, and the technology was pretty limiting. Now, I don't want to give you a false impression that there were no exceptions to that. In fact, one of the first truly story-driven games was released the same year Jimmy Carter became the 39th President of the United States. Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs started to sell their new computer, also known as Steve 2, and Star Wars, the original one, was released in theaters all around the world. 1977. And the game I am of course talking about is Zork, and if you're asking yourself right now, what the fuck is Zork? Then you are definitely not alone, because I didn't know about it either. Obviously I was curious, so I bought it for science, and I have to admit I was way too dumb to figure it out on my own, because look at this! This is literally the whole game, you just type shit! But after looking up the 30 pages manual, which to be fair is probably what I should have started with, I managed to figure out that I'm an adventurer looking for wealth and, well, adventure. But basically, instead of focusing on gameplay, the game was made around the story. No scoreboard, just you and your very beige 1970s keyboard. And yeah, I know, but remember, it was made 45 years ago by 4 MIT students, and although it wasn't the first game of its kind, it was one of the most distinguished ones from that era and this new genre. But as I already said, Zork was an exception for early games because for a very long time, even if the story existed, it was just an afterthought. Something that developers would come up with only later in the development cycle to give an excuse for the gameplay and further motivate the player to engage with said game, in addition to the scoreboard. For example, in the original Mario, you have to save Princess Peach, and this is why you go around and murder innocent turtles all over the Mushroom Kingdom. But we don't explore the psychological struggles of the princess in captivity, or how Mario battles his demons as he slowly realizes that as his journey progressed, he became the very thing he swore to destroy. And it's fine, because it doesn't need to do that. Rescuing the princess is just an excuse for doing platforming, eating mushroom, or abusing turtles. Even later games like GTA 3 suffered from the same basic problems. Grand Theft Auto 3 was revolutionary in every sense because it gave the players an overwhelming sense of freedom, like no other games were able to before. The main focus was to let players mess around in an open world and have fun. Yes, there was a story about Claude who was betrayed and sent to prison by his girlfriend or whatever, but the thing is, as a player, I didn't care about any of the characters or their motivations, at least not deeply. And I don't have a problem with that because, as I said, it wasn't the point of the game. Not to mention that the main protagonist was silent, which might theoretically help in being able to project your own personality on him, but I felt extremely disconnected. And Rockstar obviously knew that because, along with other things, this issue was addressed in GTA Vice City and San Andreas, especially San Andreas, where Carl had complex relationships and motivations and dealt with themes of brotherhood, betrayal, and ambition. It wasn't perfect, but it gave us a deeper understanding of CJ and gave us a reason to empathize with him. at least in cutscenes, but we'll talk more about them in part 2. The story-driven genre really started to gain popularity in the late 2000s, when the gaming industry decided on three things. 1. Every game absolutely needs an uninspired multiplayer mode that no one was playing about 2 weeks after the game's release. 2. What gamers really want is a game about planning weddings, and release the atrocity called Imagine Wedding Designer for Nintendo DS. What the fuck, Ubisoft? And 3. That almost every game needs to have a cinematic story heavily inspired by movies and TV. And for the most part, I was totally okay with that. Games like BioShock set the standard for what can be done, narratively speaking, in a video game. Yes, the emphasis was still on combat, because of course it was. But the game is also surprisingly deep in the story department. Rapture, the underwater city where the game takes place, is filled with lore and environmental storytelling. The setup is believable and consistent throughout the whole game, and it has one of the best endings I ever experienced. And that is why it's so hard to put BioShock down after starting playing. And of course there were many others like Uncharted or Mass Effect or even Call of Duty Modern Warfare, but I think that it's important that we discuss how games actually tell stories before we proceed any further, because given the interactive nature of them, it's not as straightforward as in other types of media, like movies, TV series, or Twitter feeds. And I've spent hours upon hours reading thesis papers, more specifically those two, so you don't have to. Although I have to say, I think they're quite good. In Understanding Video Games book, Nielsen said, and I quote, "This is a video game, so nothing will happen unless you act." And I think that it's an important distinction, because unlike any other media, video games are dependent on players' actions to make things happen. And combined with their visual aspect, well, except for Zork. Zork, you get a very unique combination. Think of a game like Fallout or Super Mario Galaxy or Imagine Wedding Designer. Okay, maybe not that last one. But if you visited a friend and saw him play one of those games for the first time without any context, I'm pretty sure you would still be able to piece together what genre and understand the mood and tone, sometimes even on the subconscious level. In Uncharted 4, during the Normal Life chapter, we had an opportunity to explore Nathan's and Elena's house, and this part carries a lot of symbolism as pointed out by Crossbreed55 on the Uncharted subreddit. The chapter starts in an attic. The room feels uncomfortable because we see that Nathan crammed all of his past there, while the main house is exclusively dedicated to his newly found family life. But you can sense the unbalance because being an adventurer is such a huge part of Nathan, yet it's locked away in this tiny room, giving you that feeling that something is not quite right, which helps to consolidate his character and helps us understand the reasoning behind his actions later in the game. And even if you didn't actively notice it while playing, you still pick up on it. And I think that it's incredible because it was communicated to us through gameplay, subtle cues, and environment, instead of just fucking spelling it out loud, or even worse, forcing us to read it in a note. Speaking of notes, Rasputin, and I really hope I pronounced it correctly, made a great video about it which I linked in the video description, so I will not go too deep into that. But I'll say this much, in Uncharted 4 I enjoyed finding and reading the notes because they added an additional, although optional storyline that I would have completely missed out on otherwise. But in Control, I stopped caring and started ignoring them after a while because holy shit, if I wanted to read that much I would have gone to a library instead. Like seriously, this game, DLCs included, has 411 notes and audio files. Are you fucking kidding me? 400 cutscenes. Cutscenes are probably the first thing that comes to mind when you think about stories in video games, and the reason for that is they are the most obvious and sometimes the most immersion-breaking method of delivering a story, because of that constant flip-flopping between interactive gameplay and passive observing in some games. I don't usually mind them per se, but they can be overused as fuck sometimes. Metal Gear Solid 4 is universally acclaimed, but this 20-hour long game has literally 9 hours and 5 minutes of cinematic cutscenes, with one of them being 27 minutes long. Like, am I playing a game or watching a movie at this point, because I can't really tell. And yes, I know, Kojima wanted to be a filmmaker and he brought all of his passion into those cinematics, which a lot of people love and for good and solid, unintended reasons, but I just wish more of it was done through actual interactive gameplay instead of a cutscene. like using scripted events or conversations between characters during combat and traversal. Like imagine for a second that in God of War, instead of being able to use a boat while you are listening to Mimir telling stories, providing more lore, you'd have to pick a destination and watch an unskippable cutscene while his dialogue plays out. Yes, the result would be similar in a sense that you'd reach the same location while getting the same exposition during the same amount of time, but for you, as a player, it would be a completely different and much duller experience because that backstory wasn't delivered to you during interactive gameplay. And the reason I spent forever writing this longest section of the script explaining how video games tell stories is that despite the metas themselves being pretty obvious, they are not as easy to implement properly. In my opinion, this is like the main cause for some gamers to still believe that stories are not as important in games, which, don't get me wrong, is still true in some cases, but it heavily depends on the game structure and whether the story implementation makes sense and was done correctly in relation to said structure, which I will be talking about right now. There are 4 structures that are considered to be mainstream in game development, and if I missed any, make sure to yell at me in the comment section, because there is about 100% chance that I did. The first one I want to talk about is a string of pearls, and it basically means that the story bits, aka pearls, are connected by strings of gameplay, and you, as a player, will experience those sequences in the order they were designed to be experienced. Nice way to complicate the linear game, right? A game that comes to mind is Sniper Elite V2, and although there are a ton of other games with a similar structure, I want to talk about this game specifically because A, it's like the most basic example of a decent linear game I could think of, and B, because there's only so much time I can spend replaying games for any given video, and I just happened to finish it a couple of weeks ago. But first thing first, I want to make something very crystal clear. I really enjoyed it. The gameplay was fun and super satisfying, so if you are into stealth-focused third-person shooter games, then you should definitely give it a try. But does it come to mind when I think about my most beloved games? Not really. And the reason for it is very simple. Let me explain. When the mission starts, you get a voiceover narration of what it is you're supposed to be doing. You get dropped into the mission where you can choose if you want to take the quiet approach or just barge in like it's a fucking Call of Duty. And by the way, my recommendation would be to play it on the highest difficulty because it pretty much takes away the second option, forcing you to sneak around and take out enemies from afar, you know, like an actual sniper. But regardless, you get to your objective, watch a cutscene, shoot whoever it is you're supposed to shoot, and escape. Rinse and repeat. And it's not necessarily a bad thing because I like shooting bad guys in super cinematic ways as much as the next guy, but my problem was that I didn't care for a second about why I do what I do. It was basically, well, the game told me to go there and kill this dude, so I did. Like again, I did really enjoy it, but it's not going to be one of those games I will randomly think of like 10 years from now and decide to replay it on a whim. What I'm getting at is, yeah, not every linear game has to have a story because it can work without it in certain circumstances, but those games pale in comparison to those that actually have interesting and compelling motivators and characters, at least for me. The second structure I want to talk about is a branching narrative, and the definition of a branching narrative is games like Detroit Become Human. The whole game was made with the story in mind and crafted around it. You, as a player, have to make choices that affect the outcome, because depending on your decisions, your experience and my experience will be very different. At least in the story department, because the gameplay is taking a back seat. Even Quantic Dream, people who fucking made it, call it an interactive drama instead of a video game, and yeah, I agree. It's not a bad thing if that's what you're looking for, but you will not be engaging with super in-depth gameplay mechanics like in Witcher 3, and you will never feel fully in control because pretty much all you will be doing is picking dialogue options and performing quick-time events. Fortunately, the story is great and your choices actually have weight, in contrast to games like The Walking Dead, which only claims to do that, but in reality, I just wish there were more things for me as a player to participate in. I think that just like in early games where the story was an afterthought, a lot of the games from this category suffer from gameplay being an afterthought, so they never reach their full potential. Just like me in an amusement park. And by the way, this was my awful attempt at doing a segue to the next structure. In games like GTA, you have a variety of missions, side missions, and activities that you can choose to participate in or not participate in at any given time, and mostly in any order you choose, i.e. amusement park. And it's amazing because it gives the player that freedom of choice. But the downside of that structure is that it's very hard to build a compelling story for those types of games, since you can't really anticipate in which order the player will choose to engage with said story. Mind you, it's not impossible because those games exist, and I think that The Witcher 3 is a great example of that, but other games fail in bringing the world and characters together. Like in GTA 5, Michael is an ex-criminal with an interesting backstory of how he made a deal with an FBI and went into witness protection.
Witness protection for what? No one was convicted of anything.
Sorry, Matt. But what I am saying is there is a lot to his character. Or Franklin, who is this ambitious guy who had nothing and wanted to build a name for himself. And when you're watching the cutscenes or listening to dialogue, they're believable until... yeah, until I control them. Then they're just mindless psychopathic killing machines who don't care about killing civilians without any reservation or mercy at all. Also, in case you didn't notice, I didn't mention Trevor here once because he's like the only one who I could actually see doing something like that based on his character traits. This is LOU narrative dissonance, by the way. And I bet you're really surprised that I didn't mention Uncharted while talking about it, didn't you? And I'm not saying that it makes GTA 5 a bad game, because it's simply not true. And you can also make an argument that you are not supposed to take it seriously, which I agree with, but what I am saying is that the story is not as engaging as it could have been. Luckily, the gameplay more than compensates for that, so I didn't mind it nearly as much as I would otherwise. Another example is Far Cry 6, which, to be fair, I did talk a lot about in my open world games are overrated video, but it suffers from the lack of immediacy. Like, something happened and I need to save my friend who was taken, but first I'm gonna fuck around with enemy outposts and go fishing. My friend, yeah, he's gonna be just fine, no need to worry. What I'm getting at is, in those types of games, I think that it's more important to get the gameplay right rather than the story, but personally, I would love to see both. The last structure I want to talk about is building blocks. Building blocks is when the player is given full freedom to do whatever the hell he wants within the gameplay mechanics. So games like Factorio, No Man's Sky, Stardew Valley, and not just because of the blocks, but Minecraft. And I'm going to kinda contradict myself here, since I have been talking forever about how important stories are in video games, but I think that those sandbox type games shouldn't have a story apart from a small gentle push towards the end goal. Like, imagine for a second that Minecraft had a story. What could it possibly be like? You were an ordinary and immature slacker who lacked confidence until you decided to do parachuting into Asian Pacific archipelago with your friends. Wait, that's already a game, isn't it? Ooh, I know. You went looking for your long-lost brother only to discover that the whole place is crawling with zombies. Oh shit, that's a game too. I know, okay, last attempt, I swear. Your wedding planner. Fuck! Okay, that small freakout aside, now with all that background knowledge, we can finally talk about how, and more importantly why, the story actually makes a game better by spoiling the shit out of the first Last of Us game. The purpose of story-driven games is to experience the story through the game, which, I mean, duh, but it's important, because this aspect of interactivity is what makes it unique when compared to other types of media. If we take a look at a game like It Takes Two, which is easily in my top 10 games of all time, you don't actually need to pay attention to the story to enjoy it. Like, the diversity of different gameplay mechanics that vary from chapter to chapter actually made it engaging enough for me on its own. But guess what? It's infinitely better if you decide to actually look around, listen to the story and engage with the characters. The amount of environmental storytelling, humor and emotion made me reevaluate my past relationships and think that maybe I should have done things differently. And all that combined with the amazingly fun gameplay made it such a memorable experience that I felt like it actually had an impact on me as a person, which is really fucking impressive given that it's a video game where you essentially control two dolls. And this is a running theme with all of my most beloved games. Like the emotion and the impact part, not the dolls part. Some of you may know that The Last of Us is my favorite game of all time, and I know for a fact that I'm not alone in this. But why the hell do so many people love this game so much? I mean, obviously because of the story of Ellie and Joel, but I want to dig a little deeper. One of the many things this game does very well is in motivating you to see it through, because it gives you a compelling reason for every little thing you do in the game. For example, a couple of hours into the story you'll go to Billstown to get a car. If it was like any other generic amusement park type game, that it probably would have felt like a fetch quest that those games love so much. Yeah, so go there and get this car because fuck you. But here you always know exactly why you do what you do. You're gathering supplies to kill the infected blocking the entrance to the school, which you need to get into to find a car battery, that you need to fix the car, that you need to be able to drive to Tommy's, because you have to find out where the Firefly hideout is to get Ellie there to maybe find a cure and create a vaccine, and maybe also because you feel like you owe it to Tess, or maybe because you still feel guilty about the death of your daughter Sarah. Do you see what I mean? Everything is connected and makes sense within the context of the gameplay, so you feel motivated to do whatever the game asks you to do, instead of just being like, okay, fine, let's just get it over with. Another thing is meaningful agency, which basically means that you have the freedom of choice, and those choices have an actual impact on your experience. And you might say something like, well, The Last of Us is a linear game and you have no choice. What, are you stupid? What the hell are you even talking about? And to that I say, shut up. There are a ton of examples of how The Last of Us uses its story and gameplay to give us that meaningful agency and bridge the gap between them. At the beginning of Chapter 2, when you get to walk around the quarantine zone for the first time, you will see soldiers gathering civilians who try to sneak in, and you can choose to approach one of the soldiers. Of course, I was curious, so I did. The soldier pushed me to the ground and said something like,
"Next time I'm gonna put a bullet in your head."
So I was like, huh, but will he though? Yeah, he definitely will. And I mean, it's cool because it's not a mandatory interaction and it adds information about the world through gameplay without being on the nose. Now you know that the military is not fucking around and will kill you without hesitation if you step out of line. Another example is shiv doors you can find in the game, and to open them you need to use up a full shiv, which is one of the only things you can use to kill clickers quietly. So do you use it to potentially get more supplies or not? Do you even have a full shiv to begin with, or did you waste all of them on clickers in the previous section? That's a cool choice, because your option will differ depending on your playstyle. For me, the solution was obvious because I am what you might call
Rick fucking Master!
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Ellie. So I would usually use stealth, and if I was detected, I would use bricks, bottles, and my meat hooks. So resources were never a problem for me on any of my playthroughs, even on grounded mode. But you can choose to use firearms on everything and it's fine, because this is your experience. And both approaches make sense within the context of the story and characters. And also the supplies you gather or waste carry between chapters, which helps in keeping you immersed, because you feel like what you do actually fucking matters. And speaking of immersion, to get it right you need both gameplay that is consistent with the set of rules that was set up in the game, and characters whose interactions and growth make sense so you can actually care for them. The gameplay part is easy to explain. Like if you were playing, I don't know, Sniper Elite 2, which tries to be this semi-realistic World War II sniper game, and on the last mission, out of the blue, you get a jetpack. Your first reaction wouldn't be like, oh cool, it's a video game, let's have fun and mess around. Instead you'd probably be more like, wait, what? That's stupid, that doesn't make any sense. But in Saints Row you wouldn't question it because it is within the established rules, however unrealistic it is. As for the characters, well, it's a bit harder. In The Last of Us, we see Ellie and Joel change and grow as characters throughout the game. In the beginning, Joel doesn't give two shits about Ellie.
To be honest with you, I give two shits what you're up to.
And he doesn't want to because he is afraid to let anyone close after losing Sarah all those years ago. But towards the end, it changes as he fully accepts her as a daughter and he opens up to her and becomes more patient, and we see that he's willing to do whatever it takes to make sure she's safe. And I don't know about you, but at the very end, I haven't skipped a beat when I had to kill the sergeant because the game made me care about Ellie that much, so I just couldn't let her die regardless of consequences. And the beauty is that the character development doesn't happen only during cutscenes because Ellie is not just a plot device. As Joel begins to trust her more, they start to rely on each other during the gameplay sections, and the dialogue between them is so freaking believable that I just can't explain how much it made me connect with both Ellie and Joel. And again, because it was consistent with the gameplay, it made me fully immersed, unlike any other game where the story is minimal or non-existent. Like in Tomb Raider, which clearly attempted to get me to care about its characters, I didn't give a damn about any of them, because they felt like they were there just to move the plot forward. I don't know, characters like Alex, who apparently had a thing for Lara, so he volunteered to go back to their ship and bring the parts they needed to make her notice him, and he ended up dying in front of her in a cutscene. I can tell that it was trying to be a dramatic moment, but I didn't know Alex, so I had a hard time empathizing with him and feeling for his sacrifice. Now compare it to characters like Henry and Sam, who also appeared relatively briefly in the game, but they were fully fleshed out and compelling characters with their own flaws and motivations, like when Henry decided to abandon Joel and try to save Sam and himself. Dan's a believable character because he wasn't fucking perfect, but guess what? Neither are we, and that's what makes us human. And that's why when they died, it was so fucking powerful, in contrast to the death of Alex, whose name I literally had to Google despite finishing the game less than a year ago. I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, games can be fun without a compelling story, but I want games to be something more than that. I want them to be memorable, and I want to be able to feel something and not just say, oh, so that was fun. Next. A little while ago, I saw a video made by Anthony Birch, who I found out about while binging Nakey Jakey. He was talking about why video games simply being fun isn't enough, and despite him releasing it way back in 2009, I think that it's still pretty relevant. The main idea was that video games have to be more than just one thing, and he drew parallels between games only being fun and nothing more, to movies being locked into one genre. Like every movie being an action movie. I mean, action movies are fun, and sometimes I want to have fun and watch an action movie by myself, or maybe with my friends, but it doesn't mean that I want to exclusively watch action movies for the rest of my life. And if you only like action movies, then there's nothing wrong with that, but having that variety and options might, and in fact did, help me personally in introducing people to gaming who never would have been interested if every game was like Dark Souls or Doom or Call of Duty. That is why I think that it's so important for the developers to try to do something more with this interactive medium. Create compelling stories that are not only fun on the mechanical level, but also tackle mature themes and actually make us feel something. And I'm not trying to say that everyone needs to try to shoehorn a story into a game when it doesn't make sense, because no, it's dumb. There should be games that aren't just mindless fun, but what I am trying to say is that stories in video games are a lot more important for the future of gaming than some people think, and they're probably the main reason I still play as much as I do. And by the way, one of my favorite gaming genres is horror, which I firmly believe to be a lot more effective than in other types of media, which is exactly what I'm talking about in detail in this video, and you should totally check it out. Big thanks to my Patreons and channel members for making those videos possible, and thank you for watching.